Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and each week we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories of the city of Mississauga together. Thank you, Romero, for your question. Always an intriguing one. Has Malton always been part of Mississauga? And it's a good question to ask. The answer is both yes and no. It's going to require a little bit of an explanation, though. Early settlement in the Malton area began shortly after the new survey of Toronto Township in 1819. The first recorded, or one of the earliest recorded settlers on the ground, was Samuel Moore in 1823, although the name of Malton doesn't appear to be applied until 1854 with the survey of the Malton town site by John Stoughton Dennis in association with the Grand Trunk Railway. But at least by the 1850s, the name Malton is in use. There's a little bit of a legend that a local blacksmith named Richard Halliday came up with the name Malton after his birthplace in Yorkshire, England. However, there isn't much evidence for that. It certainly appears that Malton comes from the 1854 survey by John Stoughton Dennis. However, regardless of all this, the town site itself, the name of Malton, was firmly rooted within Toronto Township, that is historic Mississauga, and it remained an unincorporated village within Toronto Township. Malton became a police village on January 30th of 1913. A year earlier, in 1912, Malton residents began to agitate for greater control over their own area and had explored the idea of incorporation as a village in their own right. They never went down that path very far. Ultimately, a year later, January 30th, 1913, Malton became a police village. You might wonder what a police village is. A police village can be created through bylaw by the county when the population or finances of an area were sufficient enough, but did not yet involve incorporation as a village. The county bylaw defined Malton's geographic and political boundaries, provided for an elected body of trustees, and allowed for the collection of funds, almost like an informal tax levy, if you will. The police village could establish fire, police, and safety regulations, erect streetlights, improve roads, build sidewalks, but otherwise Malton itself remained unincorporated and part of the overall township. That is part of Toronto Township, what is now Mississauga. In 1950, Toronto Township applied to the Ontario Municipal Board to annex part of Toronto Gore Township into a larger Malton. The area included 4,000 acres, and it was added to Toronto Township, enlarging the Malton area in 1952. So this is where I said yes and no. The original part of Malton, which was on the west side of Airport Road, has always been part of Toronto Township or Mississauga. The east side of Airport Road, the annex from Toronto Gore, was only added in 1952. It was originally part of Toronto Gore Township, not Mississauga. January 1st of 1952 saw the creation of Ward 5. Of course, Malton we know today is part of Ward 5 in Mississauga, but Ward 5 itself was created in 1952 in Toronto Township and encompassed both Old and New Malton, that is both east and west of Airport Road. In 1953, the Malton Village Trustees, that were established 40 years earlier as a police village, formally requested that Toronto Township take over responsibility for policing and emergency services and water. And Malton at that time had amassed a large deficit. In 1954, Malton applied to the province of Ontario to incorporate as a village, expand its borders, and separate from Toronto Township. So yes, there was a time when Malton did seek to leave what is now Mississauga. It was a messy affair, and it involved a lot of stalled bills and counterclaims by Toronto Township aimed to block Malton's incorporation and separation. The matter was deferred by the province and referred back to the County of Peel for a decision. After several days of debate, on April 14, 1954, Peel County Council voted 12-3 to reject Malton's incorporation bylaw. Malton was back at the table in 1965 with the Ontario Municipal Board requesting incorporation as the town of Malton and again separate from Toronto Township. At the same time, the province was looking to reorganize the municipalities in Peel, and as such, Malton's application for town status was deferred. So in 1965, Malton was back at it, trying to separate and become its own entity and separate from what is now Mississauga. The police village of Malton formally ceased to exist with amalgamation through provincial bylaw of Toronto Township into the incorporated town of Mississauga in 1968. As Malton was not yet incorporated, it could not oppose the provincial decision to amalgamate into the town of Mississauga. And although the decision was made on this in 1967, amalgamation did not take legal effect until January 1st of 1968. So that's the long and short of it. Most of Malton, or part of Malton on the west side of Airport Road, has always been part of Toronto Township, what is now Mississauga. And on the east side of Airport Road, it was added in 1952. There was a long and messy affair, and sometimes contentious, of Malton attempting to incorporate and separate. Ultimately, it did not achieve that status, and through the amalgamation and the incorporation of the town of Mississauga, Malton remained and still remains part of the city of Mississauga. So again, Romera, thank you for your question. Hello, Francis, and thank you for your question on the old house on Derry Road near Bramalea. And yes, the house is still there. It's had a few plans for regeneration or rejuvenation over the years, but it does remain as a relic of a former village that is no longer. That is, the house is one of the few surviving landmarks from the lost village of Mount Charles, and that's a whole other story about Mount Charles. But the house itself, to your question, it's known as the Robinson Clark House, and it was built sometime between 1875 and 1880. We suspect about 1877, 1878 as the date of construction. It is designated under the terms of the Interior Heritage Act by and it was designated in 1992. To give you a little bit of history on the property itself, the Robinson Clark House is on land that was patented to John Raper by the Crown in 1822. Raper sold the land in 1830, and it changed several times between 1830 and 1861 when Abel Robinson purchased part of the lot from Charles King. Abel subsequently deeded the land to his son John in 1875, so John Robinson became the owner in 1875. John took out two mortgages, one in 1877 and one in 1878 for $2,000 each. It's believed that those mortgages represent the improvements on the property, including the building of the house. The Robinson family sold the farm in 1908, and the last owner to farm the land was Fred Clark. He sold the property in 1961 for development purposes, although the house does remain. It is believed that John Robinson built the farmhouse between 1877 and 1878. Alfred Wedgwood owned the property and farmed here between 1908 and 1920, and then Fred Clark owned it from 1920 until 1961, and he was the last individual to farm the property. As I mentioned, the house is designated under the terms of the Heritage Act, of the Ontario Heritage Act, achieved that in 1992, and it is one of the last reminders of the lost village of Mount Charles, which was situated roughly around Dixie Road and Derry Road. Did a little description of the house. It's a two-story Victorian Gothic dichromatic brick farmhouse. It was built circa 1877. The building is an L plan with a kitchen and a drive shed extension to the rear. The drive shed extension is incredibly rare, and one of the reasons that this building is preserved. The Gothic lancet window in the dormer complements the steep pitch roof and is traditional of Victorian Gothic style architecture. The north, east, and west gable ends of the building and the dormers are decorated with a very detailed barge board. The attached drive shed, as I mentioned, quite rare and unique, and a well-regarded feature of the property. Has large arch openings with yellow brick surround details. The corners of the drive shed are decorated with yellow brick and help to integrate the drive shed to the house. On the crest of the drive shed roof towards the rear of the structure is a wooden bell coat with a small hip roof and just beautifully detailed. So that's the story briefly of the Robinson Clark House. So thank you, Francis, for spotting it and wondering what its story is. And here's hoping that the future is bright for this farmhouse, because it has suffered from some neglect in recent years, but there is some interest and some potential for rejuvenation in the future. So thank you again, Francis, for your inquiry. Our final question this week comes from Laura, and she's asking about Saddington Park and hearing that it was created by landfill. And yes, you are right, Saddington Park was created by landfill. As for who it's named for, we'll get to that in a moment. Saddington Park was indeed largely produced through landfill, extending the original shoreline of Port Credit, if you will, into Lake Ontario in the 1950s and 1960s. There was a great deal of erosion happening, some concern for some structures that were becoming increasingly closer to the water, and as a result, a large portion of Saddington Park was created as a buffer zone, if you will, to reinforce the receding shoreline. J.C. Saddington Park, as is officially known, stretches along the south side of Lake Street in Old Port Credit Village, which is a Heritage Conservation District. It offers visitors picnic facilities, barbecues, a comfort station, recreational trails, play facilities, picnic areas, and a pond. The park is also part of the also connects to the waterfront trail, and it's adjacent to the Texaco lands, but the new development that's going in Brightwater. Saddington Park was created out of landfill deposited in Lake Ontario starting in 1949 and ceasing in 1970, in part to protect against further erosion of the shoreline and that was threatening properties. The park was named for J.C. Saddington, James Cyril Saddington, who was known best as Cy Saddington, who was a former reeve and mayor of Port Credit. Located within the parks are the remains of the former Port Credit Waterworks, an early water pumping station. These brick structures date to 1922-23 and are not part of the landfill area that was part of the original shoreline. The opening of the waterworks represented a significant advancement in Port Credit infrastructure. Several houses that were once located along the south side of Lake Street, in what is now the park area, were relocated up on Mississauga Road and elsewhere to kind of make way for the park, but also to protect them from the receding shoreline. As for who the park is named for, James Cyril Cy Saddington, who lived between 1911 and 1985, was a chartered accountant and a resident of Port Credit. His father had come as a minister to Port Credit, and Cy was from an early youth for the rest of his life lived in Port Credit. He served as reeve of Port Credit between 1953 and 1958, and mayor from 1961 to 65, and mayor again from 1971 to 73. He was the last mayor of Port Credit before amalgamation in 1974. We're not entirely sure, and hopefully there's some listeners that might be able to provide the exact date, but not entirely sure when the park was named. It's believed the name was applied prior to Cy Saddington's passing in 1985, but we don't have an official recognition as to when the name was applied. But again, Saddington Park named for the former and last mayor of Port Credit, Cyril Saddington. So thank you very much, Laura, for your question. And exploring your community is always a fascinating way to wonder how things came to be and who they are named for. And again, thank you for sending your question in to Ask a Historian.